If you are here with us, you are here because you want to learn about trauma-informed and resilience-oriented leadership during pandemic times. And my name is Leora, and I'm so grateful and excited to be engaged in this conversation with all of you. So we are funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. So a disclaimer that while SAMHSA definitely supports the content of this webinar, and again, I'm going to remind you to please mute yourself. Thank you. That SAMHSA supports this webinar and also that this webinar is not necessarily of SAMHSA. So that is the disclaimer. And what do I mean by that we're funded by SAMHSA? This is hopefully one of the few tiny font slides that you will be looking at. So you'll see that there are 10 regional mental health technology transfer centers. We're a part of the Technology Transfer Center Network. There are addiction technology transfer centers. There are prevention technology transfer centers. And we are the orange or marigold, or however you call that color. We are the mental health. And we are in our second year of existence. We were launched in 2018 across the country to provide no-cost technical assistance, which is another way of saying professional development, coaching, consulting, presentations, trainings, and webinars, just like this. We are in Region 9, so many of you are from our region, and that is the U.S. Pacific Islands, Hawaii, California, Nevada, and Arizona. So welcome if you're from our region. Whoop, whoop, Region 9. I myself am based here in California. I'm a fourth generation Californian. Some of you are from other regions, and we welcome you. We collaborate with all of our partner regions across the country. If you have not yet met your regional MHTTC, please do so, and we really encourage that connection to happen. All right. Okay, so you are hearing a voice of someone you may or may not have met in real life. So nice to meet you if we have not met yet. My name is Leora. I go by she, her pronouns, and I want to name that the reason that I'm called into this work, taking a breath with that, the reason that I'm called into this work is because I fundamentally believe that there is no boundary, there's no divide between ourselves as humans, that who we are when we go into work and who we are when we go into the home, and who we are when we're with our loved ones, that we are all one whole person. And that much of what we are gifted with in 2020 is a lot of brain science and a lot of body science that's catching up with many, many generations of wisdom that's come before us to help us create workplaces that reflect our humanity. My background is in education. My doctorate is in educational leadership, and I studied the impact of student deaths on educators and really focusing on concentric circles of care. What happens to us as educators when we experience the death of students. And that broadened me into the wider world of trauma-informed everything. And that broadened me into the world beyond schools, because schools are just one platform where we can engage in healing, and we can also engage in leadership investigation of what that means to lead towards healing. So I just want to name that in my own experience, I've experienced personal trauma that I name as trauma. I've experienced personal grief, and I've also really grappled in this moment working at an organization and working in a project and working in a country of being a professional and leading with a trauma-informed and resilience-oriented lens. So I consider myself through this conversation that I might have some models and some frameworks and some questions, but I really want to be clear that I name myself also as a learner with all of you, because I certainly am no expert in this. None of us are. We're all kind of working through this together to find answers together. So all that to say, this is part of a webinar series that our center is offering, Working for Our Well-Being, a mental health awareness leadership series. So this is the first of our series. You'll see that there are many others. Our colleagues Suganya and Rochelle we'll be leading the session on the 13th, 15th, and 18th. And then I'll be back again on the 19th and 26th to do a deeper dive into self and collective care and well-being through crisis that's focused specifically on healthcare leadership. So all that to say is that there's much more to come. We know we can't get through everything this hour, even though we might want to try to. So what might today look like? We're going to start with getting some really basic language around basic brain and body architecture and really understanding the continuum of harm and healing. We're going to try and focus in on defining terms and concepts. So what does it mean when we say trauma? What does it mean when we say coping? What does it mean when we say resilience? Many of us often use a term, but we may not actually be in shared language, and that is actually foundational to this leadership practice, is ensuring that when I say trauma and you say trauma, we're understanding why and how both of us are using that term. And then we'll move into what this looks like in practice. And I just want to offer that in this time I've been saying always and now, this work is always. It's not just in this moment of COVID, it's always. And of course, it's especially heightened now. And then we'll close and move into next steps. So a couple offerings. I want to start with the offerings, which is to only take what you need from today. If it's one question or one way that I'm phrasing something or one image, take that. There is very little pressure, ask, demand for you to take it all in. There will be a lot that will be offered to you, and it's kind of like a buffet. Just take what you need, particularly because many of you are navigating big, big things in your life, and you know what you need best in this moment. The other piece that I want to name is that I just want you to know that you'll get the things that you need. You'll get the deck, you'll get the recording, you'll get the things. And so if there's a way for you to kind of put aside any questions or stress about the access, to just know that we'll provide as best as we can, and that whatever you glean from this hour is what you needed from this hour. I want to get to that this time of this webinar is limited. We have about 75 minutes with each other, but the urgency is not. And so I just want to recognize that. And as I said, this work is of always and especially now. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. The other piece that I want to name, and this is really central to our paradigm of leadership for all of us on the line, is that we believe that learning happens on 3 tracks. At any time we're in a meeting or in a learning or in a discussion, that we're learning for us as learners, for our own journey, our own, what does this mean to me as a mother, as a child, as a human, as a partner, as a professional, as a learner. You as a professional, what does this mean for me as an executive director, as a director of my organization, as a leader in my organization? And then the last track is for you as a facilitator. Many of you facilitate content that's really similar, and so you just might want to check me out and see how I word things or how I have designed things, and you might want to just check on that. But I will just note that we believe fundamentally that the transformation happens if you sit in you as a learner, even more than you as a professional. The other piece before we get into the good stuff is that the invitation for today is to land in this moment and to consider, to whom are you dedicating your learning in this next hour together? So I'm going to encourage you to have paper next to you, to have your notes out on your phone, to have something to journal and track. That's really the inquiry, is the piece of leadership that we're lifting. And I want to name that question to start you off. To whom are you dedicating your learning? To whom might you thank, literally or mentally, for guiding you in this moment? I'm just going to invite you to take a quiet moment of grounding. To whom are you dedicating your learning? And who might you thank, literally or mentally, for guiding you in this moment? And it could even look like you taking out your phone and sending a quick text message and saying, thank you for guiding me in this moment. That's it. I want to name that I am dedicating my learning and my leading in this hour to the educators who knew and loved and taught and led Ahmed Albury through his lifetime. We're going to shift, and we're going to start with this quote from our colleague Nkem Nadeso, who you'll get to learn more from on the 19th and the 26th. Nkem offers us this quote: We're not supposed to spend our time living to heal. We're supposed to heal to live. I'm going to say that one more time. We're not supposed to spend our time living to heal. We're supposed to heal to live. Part of the reason that we're starting off with that powerful quote is that oftentimes in our work, particularly in those of us who work in the mental health or in the education spheres or healthcare spheres, there's a lot of concentration, both in urgency, in email, in funding, on spending our time figuring out how to fix or put ourselves back together without thinking about why we're doing that. And we want to kind of reconfigure that and get to the healing so that we can get to the living. And why I'm saying that is because many of us think about trauma or trauma-informed as the whole thing. And I want to offer that actually this work is really about creating positive human development, cultivating positive human development across our lifetime. So you'll see this whole cycle here that the idea is that we always want to be oriented towards creating positive human development throughout our whole lifetime, to enacting well-being. And then a really big thing happens. You can see my graphic design. A big thing happens in the form of a lightning bolt or in the form of a trauma or a death or a disaster. And based on many different factors, which we'll talk about today, we move into coping, or we move into resilience, or we move into healing, to then gap back into positive human development. So I want to be really clear that leading for trauma-informed, trauma and resilience-informed and oriented leadership is to get to the coping, to the resilience, to the healing, back online to positive human development, so that it doesn't only become about the thing, it becomes about the whole story, about the whole person. So let's do a little bit of a deep dive into why and what we're orienting ourselves to. So when we think about positive human development, and this might be really basic and it might be new for you, so I'm going to go through this, but it's foundational, that we think about wellness and positive human development in these ways. On the left-hand side, you see that SAMHSA has offered us 8 dimensions of wellness. There might be more. You might actually have your own take, but that wellness is enacted socially, occupationally, right? That's our expression in our job or in our work or in our career, emotionally, financially, environmentally, physically, intellectually, and spiritually. Some of us believe that our job should speak to all of it. Some of us believe that our job should only speak to some of it. And usually that's where leadership is gets most tense, is when we have different people on our teams expecting our job to provide wellness for different dimensions. On the right-hand side, you'll see the tenets of positive human development. So we most grow and understand ourselves as human beings in this world by developing our skills, our assets, experiencing agency individually, in our families, together in peer, and by community, by making contribution, and that means through decision-making and access to power. Much of this work is about power. And having an enabling environment, which means that we experience healthy relationships, belonging, safety, and positive expectations. I'm really going to encourage you to kind of fit with those tenets of positive human development, because you might hear them come back when we talk about the principles of a trauma-informed work environment, and you might see some mirroring. The next piece is this idea of well-being, which is how we enact or how we engage or how we activate that positive human development. And the most important piece, and this comes from Diener and Seligman, where they say that people's positive evaluations of their lives, which includes positive emotion, engagement, satisfaction, and meaning, that you're going to hear the words meaning and meaning and meaning and meaning over and over again, and that's because it's essential to the human experience. So our idea of well-being is not just our access to apples and walks and kale and water, et cetera, although those are fundamental. They're also our access to the ability to find a sense of meaning in all the different spheres that we navigate. Okay, I'm going to take a breath. I encourage you to do the same. So we are going to take a couple minutes to get into our brains and the body, which really are such teachers to us in how we lead organizationally. And I want to name that being a trauma-informed and resilience-oriented leader, always and now during this pandemic, It's actually using the science and the knowledge of our brains and bodies so that they are reflected in our organizational practices. Okay, so many of you know this, and if you don't, welcome to the very basics of neurobiology. This is a very basic understanding, but it's foundational and fundamental. So many of us kind of speak in this triune brain language, this three-part brain language. And I'm using this three-part brain so that we actually think about the way that we lead and who we manage and what our needs are in an organization. So at the most foundational is our brainstem, right? Our brainstem is our brainstem connects our brains to our bodies, our parasympathetic system, which sounds like this, and our sympathetic system, which sounds like this. And our brainstem is the communication highway between our brain and our body. Our brainstem is constantly, in microseconds, in ways that we can't even measure and track, sensing what is coming in and what is coming out. And it is telling the brain and the body all the time, am I safe, 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 all the time. Even in this webinar, your brain is thinking, am I safe, am I safe, am I safe, am I safe, am I safe? If the brain appraises safety, it then moves on to the second brain, right? So we're moving from reptilian into mammalian. And if the brain signals, yes, clear, good, you're go, you can move on to the next, it's almost like Monopoly, to the next chapter, that the second brain is called the limbic system. And the limbic system is our mammalian brain. Every single mammal has this brain. It's the brain of emotions and memory. And the limbic system, we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail in a second. The limbic system is asking all the time, am I loved, am I loved, am I loved? And I want to list that is a verb that we rarely use professionally in this time. And it's also a word that people most fundamentally during COVID and always actually essentially need to know. So when I say love, I don't mean necessarily romantic love. I actually mean being seen and being witnessed. Being seen and being witnessed. Once the brain says, yes, you are loved, you are in a significant relationship, then it moves into the third brain, into the neocortex, and more specifically the prefrontal cortex, which is all about executive functioning. And that brain says to us, what meaning can I make of this? What learning? What doing? What production? The brain is hierarchical. So the brain only gets to that learning and that producing when the brain feels that it is loved, and the brain only gets to the sense of love when it feels safe. I'm going to say that another way. We cannot produce and engage in leadership and learning if we do not feel like we are in significant relationship, and we cannot be in significant relationship if we do not feel safe. So fundamentally right now, in this time of pandemic, for us as leaders, it is incredibly foundational to concentrate on safety, on significant relationship, and then on production. Okay, so we're going to move from that, and I want to just double click on zooming in on the limbic system. So this is this mammalian brain, and I want to be clear that the reason that we're focusing on the mammalian brain is because the mammalian brain is really the house of significant relationship. And that is how we both experience harm and healing. It is essential brain. So if we take a look at some of the basic components of the limbic system, some of you might be familiar with these terms, but I'm going to concentrate on two of them for the purpose of this session. One is the amygdala, and the other is the hippocampus. So many of us have heard of the amygdala. The amygdala is our main sensory house for memory, decision-making, and emotional responses. Our amygdala oftentimes gets the responsibility of that fight, flight, freeze that we've heard a lot, but it's actually so much more broad than that. It's so much more foundational and important than that. The amygdala, when the brainstem says, am I safe, am I safe, am I safe, am I safe, the amygdala actually helps the brain appraise that safety, and then helps the brain send, through memory and decision-making, back into the limbic system. So I want to say a couple pieces about the limbic system when it's under prolonged stress, which many of us might be experiencing right now, which is that just like organizations, the brain is almost a corporation or an organization or a foundation. And the brain gives more resources to the amygdala when it senses that it's under stress. So sometimes you'll hear the amygdala gets larger when it's under stress. It doesn't necessarily mean physically. It just means that it's getting more resources. And that's because the body is sensing that the body and the brain are not able to regulate, and so it needs more money, I'm going to use the word money, or resources or capital in order to do that. Which means that if you're experiencing prolonged stress, your body actually might get a little bit disoriented in understanding what is real unsafety or perceived unsafety. And a lot of us in the time of this of COVID, of this pandemic, our bodies and brains are really confused about what is feeling unsafe and what is feeling safe right now. So you might have a lot of people operating as though they are really unsafe, even though you might think that they are. So we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but safety is subjective. Safety is subjective. The other piece to name in this moment is the hippocampus. So the hippocampus and the amygdala, they hang out together. They're neighbors. You see them right next to each other. And the hippocampus is in charge of long-term memory and also brain navigation. And the hippocampus really beautifully protects our memory. It records what we might need to remember, and it also helps our body not remember things that will overwhelm us and will paralyze us in fear. So the hippocampus, opposite from the amygdala, the hippocampus actually gets much smaller in resources when it is under stress. So many of us, if we've talked to survivors of violence and you want to ask them details about what they went through, sometimes it is hard to recall because the body did exactly what it is wired to do, which is to provide a space for them to not remember things that would be overwhelming and harmful. Many of us who may have given birth, we actually might remember that too. There's a joke about that we don't remember what actual labor is like, and there's a reason for that, right? So our body has a lot of wisdom. It also means that for us as leaders and managers, that if we are asking our employees to reproduce and provide answers in this moment of big stress, we are actually not providing a space of safety or significant relationship. We are not being brain or body informed. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit into understanding attachment, and then we're going to move into talking about trauma and coping in a more concentrated way. So this comes from our teacher, Dr. Chris Blodgett at Washington State University, of course, from many other researchers on attachment that come before them. And I want to say, too, that oftentimes in the land of trauma-informed, we actually don't talk about attachment, and in the land of leadership, we don't talk about attachment. And so I want to merge both of them for the following reasons. The kind of golden egg, the way that we want to lead and have every employee, every colleague, every student, every patient, everyone experience with us is secure attachment, which in kind of the phraseology feels like this. I can rely on me, and I can rely on you. So we remember that definition of well-being, that it is our own perception, our own ability, our own subjective assessment of our worth. I can rely on me, and I can rely on you. That is where we want to go. That is the ideal human development. If we have a view of ourselves as negative, I am not worth, but a view of others as positive, we might be experiencing preoccupied ambivalent attachment, which sounds like this. I can't rely on me, so I only rely on you. I can't rely on me, so I only rely on you. And I'm going to ask, as I read these out, I'm going to ask for you to kind of, in your minds, be reflecting about how that might show up in your life. Like what kind of behavior might signal that this worldview or belief system is in place. If we go crosswalk, if we go to the view of others as negative and the view of self as positive, we get into this phraseology. I can't rely on you, so I only rely on me. I can't rely on you, so I only rely on me. And this usually comes from, and we're going to talk about complex trauma in a second, this usually comes from those of us who have experienced harm, and when they are in relationship with someone or peoples or bodies or organizations that reflect the skin or the body or the power dynamic of someone who enacted harm on them, there might be a replication of that world system. And Rochelle, my colleague Rochelle, will be teaching about implicit bias on Wednesday, and that's a really great place to get into more learning about that. I can't rely on you because someone like you or someone who looks like you has harmed me or my ancestors in the past, so I only rely on you. And the last is the fear of others is negative and the fear of self is negative. I'm not okay with you and I'm not okay without you, and I've got some unsolvable fear, and that is some of the hardest paradigms to work through. I want to be really clear that in terms of attachment, this is not an assessment. I'm not asking you to print this out and walk around your office space and say, oh, Leora, secure attachment. Oh, Leora, dismissing avoidant. Not what it's meant to be used for. It's really meant to be used to widen our empathy, to widen our landscape as leaders, to understand that many of us come from deep, deep, deep stories of harm or healing, and that really impacts the way that we build trust, that we understand someone's competence or character with whom we work. Okay, so we're going to move into trauma and complex trauma and coping and resilience and really defining the thing to work from and with the thing. Okay, so big tech slide here, but the main invitation is for you to kind of to scan down and to just check out that there are a lot of different terminologies, and all of these are engaged in the continuum of harm. So oftentimes we use the word trauma or trauma-informed, and that actually can kind of hold or encapsulate a wide variety or a wide kind of different experience of harm. And so I just want to take a moment for you to kind of do an eye gaze on the screen and to name that there might be concepts in this continuum that you might be unfamiliar with and concepts with which you are much more familiar. So that is the leadership inquiry question right now, which is that which concepts are you more familiar with? Some of you might be like, yep, ACEs, I got it. The 10 is the screener, 1997, Vincent Folletti, Robert Anza, etc. Some of you might say, oh, I've never heard of insidious and historical trauma before, and so I need to do more engagement in that work. Some of you might really resonate with the concept of secondary and vicarious trauma. So we may not have lost someone due to COVID, but we know someone who has, and we're experiencing an overwhelmed coping system in the same way. Or we might not be familiar with the term racial trauma, and that might be where our work is called into. So acute trauma, I'm going to respond to Phoebe's question. So acute trauma, if we just take a moment to look at it, acute trauma is a one moment, and actually I'm seeing that the font is a little bit tricky here, so forgive me. But if you look up in the colon where it says a single or time-limited traumatic event, that is acute trauma. And chronic trauma is multiple traumatic exposures and events over an extended period of time. So that is actually a text confusion. So I'll just say that one more time. Where it says acute trauma, that is speaking to the sentence right before that, which is a single time-limited traumatic event. And chronic trauma is multiple traumatic events or events over an extended experience of time. So part of the invitation that I'm offering right now is that COVID and this pandemic has really caused us to experience multiple things at the same time or multiple things at different times, and it can be confusing for us as leaders to figure out what is the what. But part of the leadership work is for us to get really to get centered in where we need to do most learning in order to lead our organization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that more in a second, but I just want to name something very clearly, and this comes from the teaching of Kanwarpal Dhaliwal at RISE in Richmond, California. And Kanwarpal Dhaliwal says very clearly that it cannot be trauma-informed if it's not racially just. It cannot be trauma-informed if it's not racially just. So if we are talking about trauma, if we're talking about trauma-informed organizations, and we're not engaging in a concept or in discussion around our commitment to anti-racism, we actually will be missing the picture. We're going to be missing the whole picture. So we need to, as leaders, it's a invitation to think about how the two are matched. And I just want to name that the definition is matched to the term right above it, except for chronic and acute, and I will absolutely correct the slide and we'll send it out afterwards. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so the piece that I want to narrow in on is complex trauma, and that is because complex trauma is a term that often occurs within caregiving relationships. So the piece about caregiving relationships is that if we think about the teachings from Chris Blodgett, who just taught us about the directions of attachment, Chris Blodgett says, who you love is not who you may be able to count on. Who you love is not who you might be able to count on. So if you think about it, we are born as humans needing support and needing people to provide for us. We are deeply interpersonal and interdependent human beings. And what happens is that when those who we expect to provide for us or care for us harm us, it disorganizes and kind of disrupts our understanding of our worth and our understanding of what it means to be in connection. So oftentimes in our work, complex trauma is really talked about in the individual interpersonal relationship. And what I'm going to introduce for you today is what it might actually look like to consider complex trauma on the scale of an organization or on a system. What does it look like for when a system who's supposed to provide actually ends up harming? And so many of us in this time of the pandemic are actually experiencing the complex trauma, particularly because we may have expected a healthcare system to provide for us, but got confusion in response. Or we expected XYZ and got XYZ. And sometimes that can create some disorganization. Not always, but sometimes. Okay, so I just wanted to pause here for those of you who are familiar with trauma and adverse childhood experiences and just name that sometimes we hear the confluence between an adverse childhood experience and trauma, and I just want to parcel out the two before we get into some of the applicable work. So I just want to name that many of us can have something that happened to us in childhood that was harmful and experience that as trauma. And many of us might experience something that was harmful in childhood and not experience that as trauma, right? So some of us know someone, like I know that my grandmother, had she taken the ACEs score or the ACE assessment, my grandmother would have scored a 9. I've taken it for her. And she deeply, deeply related to the word trauma and deeply enacted trauma in her life and in her workplace. But I also know that people who may have had a score of 10, a large score of ACEs, do not relate to the idea or identity of trauma, and that's because they had a significant person or relationship help them make meaning of what was going on for them in their lives. So the biggest differential between trauma and ACEs is that we have someone to help us make meaning of what's going on. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. I'm not going to go into this so much, but I just want to bring up, because I believe that it's important, that many of us talk about adverse childhood experiences, but I want to name that it's being much more broadened into adverse childhood, adverse community, and adverse environmental, adverse climate experiences. So you'll hear right now that many of us are thinking about the triple realms of ACEs: adverse childhood, adverse community, and adverse environmental or climate experiences. And so for many of us in our leadership, we might take this moment to think, what might I need to do more learning about? It might be at the community level, it might be at the climate level, or it might be at the household level. Okay, so I just wanted to name before we transition that many of us talk about ACEs, either a neglectful household or abuse experience in our childhood or big overwhelming things, as trauma, and it may not always be the case. And so I just want to name that ACEs do not always equal trauma, and that significant relationships can be really big pivotal buffers. The second piece that's really important, particularly for this time and always, is that being a member of a marginalized population, whether you identify as queer or Black, brown, Indigenous, API, does not equal that you have an experience of trauma or an adverse childhood experience. It might be a risk factor because of social determinants of health, but it is not the whole story. The other piece that I want to name, especially in the time of the pandemic, is that it is not about the event, it's about the experience of the event and the making meaning of the event. So it's not the harm right now that many of us might be navigating is not about COVID or a pandemic or shelter in place. It might be about how we are accessing conversation, accessing meaning, accessing the story around what we're experiencing. The other piece that I want to name for equity purposes is that while many of us are all experiencing COVID and the pandemic, Brittany Cunningham says that we're all experiencing the same storm, but we're in really different ships. And so from an equity stance, we want to think about what are the universal experiences that all of our employees or colleagues might be having, and also from an equity stance, what might be different access points to healing across our workforce that we need to be really clear about and then respond to. Okay. So all that to say, you'll see this in your deck, and we're not going to spend time here because I want to get to the next space. But I did offer some reflection questions, which is like, which concepts would you need to do more work on to better serve yourself, your colleagues, and who your organization serves? Which concepts are getting less attention, money, discourse, media, and why? Right? So we might actually be thinking, we might be talking a lot about ACEs and not a lot about racial trauma. And we want to actually lift that up and problematize that in our work so that we can be really equity and justice minded. Okay, the last piece, and really by that I mean really the last piece in this chapter, is that you'll see on this slide that I've pulled many variations of the term trauma. And I think a lot of times in this work, for us as leaders, we're using terminology, and I'm going to encourage us to take a pause moment to do some reflection about why we're using what term and what definition. So again, you'll have this in your slide deck, but I just wanted to name that there are many variations in how trauma is defined. And for us as leaders, we want to use definitions that match not only our mission and our vision, but also who we serve and who makes up our workforce. So if you even just take an eye scan, some of the context in the definitions might call us to different programs, practices, and policies differently if we were using one definition or the other. So oftentimes as a facilitator, we show many different definitions, and then we offer leaders, and I encourage you to do this. If we were in person, we'd encourage you to do this in person. We offer leaders the ability to actually reflect on what would be the implications of choosing which definition for whom and by whom relating to your strategic plan and relating to your work. Okay, so you just heard some of those questions, so I'll say those questions out loud, but the reflection questions that I'm offering you is what it might look like to collectively agree on a definition from which you can ensure inclusion, direction, and collective vision. And how might the language you use be intentional, informed, reflective of the needs, of your needs, and who you serve? So many of you might be familiar with this concept. The concept is this idea of triple E's. So I'm just going to say this pretty quickly, which is that the kind of combo platter, the recipe for what might be trauma, is an event, experience, and effect. And all of it is completely subjective. So you can have the same people experience the same event, just like we just talked about, right? Same storm, but different ships. So COVID-19 is existing in almost all of our realities. It might be experienced incredibly differently because of our own individual or collective assets, accesses to healing, and positionality, and might have different effects. And all of it is dynamic, and incredibly subjective. I'm going to continue to say subjective because I want to just lift up that for us as leaders, one of the biggest takeaways in this moment, leading during a pandemic, is to not assume that your story is everyone's story and to not assume that everyone's story is your story. So for us as leaders, we actually have to open ourselves vulnerably that many people in our organization might be having really different responses. And we want to program for the employees that might be experiencing the most harm and then work backwards. So we don't program for our employees that are the most resourced and accessed. We program for our employees that might be experiencing the most harm and work from there. Okay. So as Deb Dana says, trauma is both a psychological and physical experience that impacts our internal sense of safety, our ability to trust in ourselves, in our relationships, and in the world. So fundamentally, this work about being trauma-informed is understanding that it is a both and. It is mind and body, and most importantly, it can rupture our worldview. It can rupture our experience of am I safe, am I loved, and am I in an ability to provide meaning-making and engage in meaning-making? So some of you might be familiar with this concept on windows of tolerance. I'm going to invite you to our future webinars to learn more about the window of tolerance or to even Google it, or to spend time with our deck. But I want to name that in this moment of pandemic, in this moment of an overwhelmed coping system, that some of us might be in a hyper-aroused space where we might be in a more space of fear or overwhelmation or more outbursts, more rigidity. That might be an indication that we are in a hyper-aroused state, and you can learn more about that in our upcoming sessions. The opposite is moving into a hypo-aroused, into a freeze response. So some of us actually kind of dissociate, we shut down, we might disconnect, we might just kind of want to hide under our covers and separate our sense of self from our feelings and our emotions. I know I just had a conversation with a colleague the other day who said very nonchalantly, yes, my cousin died from COVID last week, I'm going to the funeral, when do you need the deck, when do you need the webinar from? Right, just very kind of nonchalantly, separation. So all of these, I just want to be really clear that both reactions and responses are completely natural, and they are our body's way of responding to our inputs and our outputs. It's our body's way of responding to survival. So as leaders, it's so important that we do not shame and we do not value one response over the other. We do not shame and we do not value one response over the other. So you'll see on the left, there is there are factors that get us out of our comfort zone, and there are also factors that help get us in our comfort zone. And I really encourage you as leaders, as managers, to sit with individual employees or as your team and actually be explicit. What is your natural response to when things get overwhelming? Do you go fight, flight? Do you go hypo? What helps you get back in the comfort zone, and what helps you go out of the comfort zone? Okay. All that to say is that on the left-hand side, we talked about the brain energy earlier, and the brain energy allocation, when regulated, least needs funding for survival, then goes into supporting our regulation, which is about that window of tolerance, getting us into our comfort zone, then can process our connection, our social-emotional connection, and then can process our output, right? That's on the left-hand side, and that's how actually most of our workplaces and work cultures are functioned and geared towards. But when the brain is experiencing harm, the brain goes opposite because it is beautifully wired to protect us. So all the energy, all the funding, resources goes to survival, then to regulation, then to our social emotional connections, and then into cognition. So I just want to be clear that for those of you who are feeling like, oh, man, I'm like slower on my game with responding to emails or making decisions, that is a completely natural state of when you are experiencing harm. And by harm, I just mean an overwhelmed coping system. So again, I want to normalize and I want to name that you could either have a kind of brain-body experience on the left or a brain-body experience on the right or in between. And that is part of what this pandemic experience really offers us. Okay, last, before we move into our next chapter, which is that I want to really name the concept of trauma capital. meaning that many of us think about trauma and we think, ooh, big, scary, icky, no, bad, pathology. And I want to just normalize, name, and honor that many of us who have experienced trauma in our lives actually develop gorgeous capital that help us in our adult lives. We may have experienced hypervigilance to protect ourselves, and that hypervigilance as adults and as employees is what makes us look out for others, or deeper sense of empathy, or a deeper attunement into other people's needs. And so part of what I'm going to offer us as leaders is to also watch how much we're framing trauma and harm as a deficit versus trauma and harm as a potential and as a strength when provided healing and regulation. Okay, I'm gonna take a breath. Okay, so many of you are doing this already in the comments box, but I am gonna invite you to just kind of name a takeaway or a aha or a reminder thus far, and that's gonna go in the comments box, not in the questions box, so in the comments box. And we are going to, and then we're gonna move forward. And I just want to name that you will get all the slides, and even if we don't get to everything, that's okay, because I said at the top we're going to get to exactly what we needed to get to. Okay, so some of you are saying window of tolerance, open discussion with team, 3 E's, safety, it's not about the event, it's about the experience, meaning making, same storm, different ship. That's Brittany Packnett Cunningham. I want to give her the honor, like Black women, the honor of saying that. Brain energy allocation, yes. Digging the historical and racial trauma discussion, it's often lost. Andrea, it's often lost because it's often led by folks who are not grounded in their own anti-racism framework, so I thank you for naming that. And the power of relationships to mitigate, great. Okay, keep these coming, and I am going to move forward. The person who said if it's not trauma-informed, if it's not racially just, is Kanwarpal Dhaliwal from RISE, R-Y-S-E. In Richmond, California. So we're going to move into the next section, and I'm going to move through it pretty quickly because this is the setup for the rest of our sessions, which is this. If you get anything from our session today, it is this. Relationships can harm and relationships can heal. Leadership can harm and leadership can heal. Always and now. Both and. So when we talked about that cycle, right, the big thing happened, the event happened, the experience happened, the dysregulation happened, and now we want to think about what coping is. So I just want to name, this is really important to parcel out, that coping is a combination of strategies and tools for us to ground and respond to what our bodies and brains are defining as a threat. Coping is super individualized. And what I love about the researchers, Fulton and Lazarus, who are really the kind of foundational writers in stress and coping, that they say that coping is when an individual believes they have the resources to respond effectively. Believes they have resources to respond effectively, right? So I just want to say that you might have your kid, you might have your colleague, you might have yourself, and you go, Leora, you have everything that you need right now. Why are you stressed out? It doesn't actually have to do with the tangible resources. It has to do with the emotional belief that I have the resources to respond. Okay? If we then move, if we believe that we have the resources to respond, right, because these are a little bit in stages, if we believe that we have the resources to respond, then we move into resilience. Resilience is not an outcome, it's a process. So it is dynamic. It's not bouncing back. Oftentimes we hear being resilient is bouncing back, but I want to be clear that it's not. The reason that it's not is if we say, if resilience is bouncing back and then the individual or the people don't bounce back, the onus or the punishment or the shame gets put back on those people or on that person, which is not trauma-informed or resilience-oriented. So resilience is an individual and collective experience. Joanne and Matt, I'm hearing some noise in the background, so if we can get help with that. So resilience is individual and collective, and it's also deeply culturally informed. The way that we understand our ability to navigate all the different resources that we talked about at the beginning, individually and collectively, which means that I might believe that I have the ability to navigate, but if society doesn't validate my navigation, then I am not being able to fully experience resilience. So for us as leaders, that's part of our bias work, is to be clear about what behavior do we validate as resilience and what behavior do we invalidate as resilience, and why. The next piece is the piece that usually gets least discussed, and it is the piece that I'm hoping that, that has some resonance with the 300 plus of us that are on the line right now, which is this concept of healing. We can't stop at resilience. We get from coping to resilience, then to healing. And the foundational practice for healing, guess what? You're going to hear it again, is meaning making, is repair, is renewal. It's not necessarily the question of, oh, everything happens for a reason. It's not necessarily the question of, what's the silver lining in COVID? That's not healing. That might be escapism. Healing is actually really understanding the root cause and the structural cause of the harm, and then doing hard work to repair it. So you'll see the quote is from Sean Ginwright on the page that's focusing mainly for those of us who work with young people, which are many of us on the line. And you'll also note that the way that Ginwright structures healing, which I want to lift up, is that healing also focuses not only on the person who is harmed, but also the person who is the harmer and everyone who is involved in both of those people's lives. It's thinking about the whole ripple effect. Okay. So last but not least piece is that I want to, again, go back to the wisdom of our brain and our bodies, which many of us forget, but we really know that our brains are neuroplastic. Our brains have the ability to form and reorganize synaptic connections, meaning that we are constantly rewiring and reorganizing for healing. That is the innate architecture of our bodies. So my question to all of us is, how can we as organizations mirror the wisdom of our brains? I want to name that oftentimes when I do workshops on this content with folks who identify as survivors, the concept of neuroplasticity is deeply empowering. It's deeply empowering to know that we are actually almost on train tracks, and our bodies are pleading and asking for us to heal, not just to cope and not just to be resilient. Okay. So I'm actually going to move through this piece right now. You can continue to put your takeaways and ahas and reminders, but I want to get to some of the tangible application pieces, because many of you are like, okay, great concept, but let's put this into practice. So I want to get into trauma-informed and resilience-oriented leadership. Aha, after all that. But I want to be really clear about why we spend so much time in the definitions and the theory, which is that many of us move to strategy before we actually are rooted in the why and the what. We move to the movement before we're grounded. And part of this work, part of our leadership work, is actually spending way more time getting grounded before we move into the what. We want to move into the why before we move into the what and the how. Okay, so we're going to move into the 5 Ps: principles, practices, policies, programs, and paradigms. Principles, practices, policies, programs, and paradigms. Yes, Sergio, neuroplasticity equals hope. Beautifully said. Okay, so many of you are familiar with Marshall Gantz. He's one of the foundational writers on social movement, and leadership is a social movement. Gantz defines leadership as, leadership is the accepting responsibility to create conditions that enable others to achieve shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. Leaders accept responsibility not only for their individual part of the work, but also for the collective whole. I'm going to say that one more time. Leadership is accepting responsibility to create conditions that enable others to achieve shared purpose. Shared purpose, right? Shared definition, shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. Leaders accept responsibility not only for their individual part of the work, but also for the collective whole. So we say that leadership is about questions and management is about answers. Leadership is about questions and management is about answers. All right, so I want to just encourage you. So Diane, that was Marshall Gantz at the very bottom of the slide. I encourage you to read his whole book. I want to just name that in 2014, many people across the country got together in New Haven to form a consensus statement around what would be the trauma-informed professional competencies for leadership. In my opinion, it's an underlooked and overlooked research paper. We spend a lot of time on other research before we do on this. But there is actually a whole paper out there that really helps us think about the competencies of what we would need to be trauma-informed. And so I'm not going to totally go through all of this. I want to offer you that this is a great checklist in your own takeaway practice. But part of leadership is really understanding the whole, is understanding not only the disorganizing effects of trauma, right? That's what we talked about, but also what it could look like to engage in interdisciplinary collaboration, what it could look like to think about the importance of using relational healing for relational injury, right? We just talked about that. What it looks like to think about this work precautionary and also through intervention. And then I want to be really clear about this. Though it is a defined, if we want to talk about evidence-based, it's not necessarily evidence-based, but it's research-based statement, consensus from researchers that one of the most foundational principles to being a trauma-informed leader is the demonstration of the ability to consistently recognize how the cultural, historic, and intergenerational transmission influences the perception of helpers, So that is a whole other conversation that I do at another time around the cultural perceptions of help seeking. But part of what this work is, again, reminding us is that if we are only thinking about our own lens, then we are missing a huge part of the picture. And if we're only thinking about someone else's lens, we're missing a huge part of the picture. It's that transmission and that interactive experience. Okay. So many of you might be familiar with this visual as well. It is tiny font. It's from the Adolescent Health Working Group. I very much recommend for you to Google and download it. It's such a huge source and wealth of information. The main piece that I want to name is that when we're saying trauma-informed care or approaches, I'm actually not just talking about anything that's related to mental health or trauma. We're talking about everything. We're talking about bathroom policy. We're talking about dress policy. We're talking about bereavement policy. We're talking about postnatal and prenatal policy. We're talking about everything. And trauma-informed approaches integrates all the learning that we just talked about. And the adage that you've heard is that a trauma-informed approach asks what's happened to you and not what's wrong with you. But actually now in 2020, because this is 7 years old, in 2020, we actually say that trauma-informed approach asks what's right with you and what may have happened to you and not what's wrong with you, right? And again, I want to be really clear for those of you who are new to this work that these are not actual questions that we're suggesting for you to ask your employees or your colleagues. These are paradigms. It's a worldview so that when your employee or when your colleague does something or says something, that the first line of response in your brain is not what's wrong with them, but is what is right with them and what might be happening with them, and not needing to know. So the biggest piece that I want to interrupt right now in 2020 is that a lot of us in the trauma-informed world think that we need to know all the things that are going on with something. We think as leaders or managers, oh my goodness, I'm now a mental health care provider. I have to open all my staff meetings asking people what's going on with them. Not true. We have to actually just assume that everyone is going through overwhelming things, and then we create policies and work cultures that allow them to best get back into that window of tolerance as much as possible. All right. On the left-hand side, you'll see the principles of trauma-informed care. And again, this is the everything. This is the everything. I'm not talking about mental health services. I'm not talking about evidence-based practices that are trauma-informed. I'm talking about the everything. And on the right-hand side are also the domains that this happens in. How we think about professional development, how we think about policy, how we think about the physical environment, right? So I just want to name that one of the clients that we used to work with identified that, you know what, one of their most foundational practices when they get back to their organization is creating non-gendered bathrooms. And that, for trans equity and for body safety, was going to be their first step, simple step into creating a physical environment that allowed everyone to access and assume that there might be even one person who might be experiencing harm when they go to the restroom, that they were going to cancel that out. So that's just one example, and how all of the work that you're doing in your equity work is deeply connected to your trauma-informed work. So let's take a double-click moment into the principles and into practice, and then we're going to get to transition. So you'll see that SAMHSA has a solid 6 that they started with in 2014, but I really want to encourage you as leaders to take the principles and then to engage with them as a platform for conversation with your colleagues so that you can find out what principles are most fundamental to help you feel whole, help you feel worth, and help you feel seen and efficacious at work. So some of your colleagues might choose safety. That might mean physical, emotional, spiritual, racial, religious, sexual. Safety is a continuum just as much as we talk about the importance to define trauma and resilience. We also want to take a moment to define safety. Many of us operate as though our definition of safety is everyone's definition of safety, and so we want to check that. Some of us might want to really maximize choice right now. So if COVID is giving us the experience that we have minimal choice and where we might be able to eat and who we might be able to touch and interact with and where we might be able to walk, how might we as leaders actually then create work cultures that are providing as much choice as possible to help balance that experience of something happening to me versus something happening with me. You'll see that there's also principles like empowerment, collaboration, and trustworthiness. The biggest piece to name in this entire slide is that a trauma-informed principle and practice is the movement from power over to power with. From power over to power with, right? If we are dominating others, if we are wanting to own others, and that includes experiences and stories and narratives, then we are enacting power over versus power with. So the piece that I want to also just name, because Prentice Hemphill has been such an incredible teacher, is they say this: unprocessed trauma disturbs our sense of safety, belonging, dignity, and purpose. People come into organizations a lot of times to reconcile some of the things that they lost through their experience of trauma, only to find a space where they can belong, a space where they can be safe, and a space where they can act out their purpose. So many of us come to this work either to replicate what we experienced in our lives or to rectify what we experienced in our lives. And part of our work as leaders is to hold all those possibilities together, to know that most likely we're called into the work, the human service work that we're doing because of our own lived experience. On the left-hand side, you see Sarah Bowman's offering, and I just want to bold it, which says the following. It says that a trauma-informed system, that leadership is a culture, not a set of services or interventions, that leaders must learn to be vulnerable if there's any hope for their organizations to truly adopt this trauma-informed culture. And it includes everyone, and it is focused on relationship power versus role power. Okay, so a couple last pieces before we get into some reflection and closing, which is that Trauma Transformed, T2, if you go to traumatransformed.org, Trauma Transformed offers us this continuum that while many of us are talking about being trauma-informed, we need to recognize that actually what might be coming before that is trauma-organized work cultures, where there's a lot of fragmentation, us versus them, competition, authoritarian leadership. So that's a lot of power over versus power with, right? I often, when I do coaching of workplaces, if I hear that the language and the discourse is saying, we can't do that because of what happened in 1973, or don't talk to her because she is XYZ, that's a lot of reliving and retelling. It doesn't mean that something is bad. It just means there hasn't been healing of some harm that has happened under the surface. If there is that addressing of the trauma-organized work culture, we might be able to move into trauma-informed culture, which again, as you'll see at the top, is really important. It happens at the client level, staff level, administration level, and government level. It's a multi-sphere experience. And that part of the foundational practice of creating a trauma-informed work culture is creating shared language, which is, as I've been doing, encouraging you to be really clear about who is saying what and why and how, and co-constructing definitions. And the other piece is the recognition of sociocultural trauma and structural oppression. So one example that many of us experienced in the time of COVID was a potential employer saying, please take sick time if you're sick. But if the employer didn't provide structural access or clear and transparent boundaries with what kind of sick leave an employee could take, that might actually disrupt or create another structural inaccess to healing. So again, we want to be transparent, we want to be clear, and we want to think about the policies that enable our employees to enact and access their healing and their resilience and their coping. The last piece is where you have heard me go over and over and over again during this hour together, which is actually not only to be trauma-informed, maybe not even to be resilient-oriented, but actually to be a healing organization always and also now. So that looks like really processing and providing opportunities as a staff to reflect, making meaning out of the past, being collaborative, and being relational. And I want to offer you that all these different concepts are listed up, but you can actually completely create your own kind of like, what would this look like and what has this looked like on your staff. But I want to be clear, as long as there's safety in order to do so. You may not get a lot if there isn't safety already provided. Okay. So you'll see that what I'm going to provide you, and I really offer this as a takeaway, is that I offered you reflection questions for each stage of that cycle, for wellness and positive development, for well-being, for coping, for resilience, and healing. And I am seeing feedback, and I appreciate you, and I'm going to ask that we can hold and process in a second so that you give me the time to move through our close. So I'm going to offer you reflection questions, and these are leadership reflection questions for you to take with you so that you can sit with them. And again, as I said earlier, that because leadership is about questions and management is about answers, that you'll notice that much of my language was more invitational than was telling you what something is. And that's part of my own trauma-informed and resilience-oriented leadership. So I also offered you more reflection questions. These are not for us to go through. These are just, I'm kind of walking you through what I'm giving you as a takeaway, with the main question of what would it feel like if your team and agency had a culture attuned to brain and body science in this moment and always. How would you make reflection, regulation, and renewal a priority? Okay, so we started with that clean graphic. I just want to name and just affirm to all of you that this is a messy experience, that we are not experts in this experience, the COVID experience or the general experience, that it's messy and dynamic and subjective and human. So it's always nice to get a really clean graphic, but that's not actually the reality. And so part of our leadership is actually to think about how might we sit in discomfort with not knowing? How might we sit with discomfort of not having an answer? Trauma transformed. Again, I'm kind of moving into some of the most distilled takeaways. If you leave anything this time together, if you leave anything from our time together, that there are really 6 C's. I'm going to invite you as leaders to step into connection, to increase safety and stability, to step into context in order to reduce stress. So always explaining the why behind a decision or a rule or a policy. Coherence, right? Creating a connected story, because that's what trauma does. It interrupts our story, and so we want to create a coherent story, beginning, middle, and end. Opportunities to collaborate. Opportunities to instill authentic hope, just like Sergio said earlier, that neuroplasticity, we are wired to heal. And then the last piece that I cannot stress enough is consent, to cultivate power with versus power over. So if you are asking your employees to tell you all the details of their lives, of what they're navigating in COVID, that may not be consent. So we might call this COVID consent. Ask someone if they want to share with you what they're experiencing, and then they can. And then ask someone if they want support in action or if they just want to have someone bear witness. Becky Hawes says all the time that trauma is running around the world trying to find a witness. Trauma is running around the world trying to find a witness. So the last piece that you'll see, and then we are going to, we're going to close. And I'm actually going to hang out a little bit so that you have some time to ask questions in the chat box if we do. But I just want to name, these are the bottom lines, right? That the language we use matters, always and especially now. So I want to be clear. I don't use the language traumatized. I use the language a person who may experience trauma, or a person who may be experiencing an overwhelmed coping system, because it's up to them to define their own experience. That this trauma-informed and resilience leadership work happens now and always, and that leadership through uncertainty is personal, structural, and procedural. And I'm going to go down a couple more just so that we get to the bottom line, which is that your story is not everyone's story, and everyone's story is not your story. But the main principle of this work is to normalize and to name and to nurture the folks that you work with. And the trauma impacts us all, but we might have the experience of the impact in a different way. So I just want to name and recognize this was a lot of information. There is a series moving forward that you can engage in your work moving forward. So if you want to learn more about leadership in times of chaos, please join Suganya on the 18th. Implicit bias, please join Rochelle on the 13th. How this lives in the bodies of those who identify as Asian Pacific Islander on the 15th. And then back with me to really dig into self and collective care and well-being through crisis on the 19th and the 26th. I'm so grateful for you, for your patience. There's a lot, and I get very excited, and there's a lot to give together, so I'm just so grateful. I wish deeply that we can be in person. I wish deeply that we can be in learning for more than an hour and 75 minutes, and I just want to name and affirm that many of you are leading outside of your own comfort zones, and that's actually the beauty of leadership, is moving into discomfort so someone else can move out of the pain and they can meet in the middle. I'll say one more time, so that you move into your discomfort as a leader so that those you serve can move out of their pain and you can meet in the middle. On that note, it is 4:15 here in California. Please feel free to put your takeaways, your offerings into the chat box. You will be getting resources for leadership in the time of COVID. You'll be getting organizations to whom we refer our learning, and please contact us and engage in resources moving forward. You will be, I'm actually going to, Joanne, I just want to name that I'm going to stay on the well-being series for at least 2 to 3 minutes, and then you will be getting a survey to get feedback so that we can provide for you. So again, I want to say thank you. I am going to take a drink of water. Sochi, yes. Strengths perspective when discussing trauma-informed practices. Yes, yes. All right. Barbara, thank you. I'm sure you are doing beautiful work. Emily, yes, what is right with you, not just what's happened to you or what's wrong with you. Thank you. All right. Wonderful. Thanks, Lion. Appreciate you. Please, please, please. Heather, I'll say that one more time. That a leader is moving out of and into your discomfort so that who you serve moves out of their pain and you can meet in the middle. I'll do that one more time because I think my brain is a little bit scrambled. Leaders moving into your discomfort so those you serve can move out of their pain and you can meet in the middle. Yeah. Okay, lovely. On that note, again, I just want to thank everyone so much. I am grateful to be with you. I'm grateful to be in community. Made me feel like I was connected. And I want to thank Suganya and Rochelle for supporting in the comments and the questions. And I want to thank my colleagues Joanne, Stephen, and Matt for supporting all the tech with such a large group. Again, we just appreciate you, and we deeply, deeply hope that you take the survey so that we can get your feedback and we continue the offerings moving forward. Yes, Colleen, a leader is moving into your discomfort so those you serve can move out of their pain and you can meet in the middle. Yes, that was great. Thank you, Priscilla. Okay, we are closing out. And Joanne is going to save the comments and the questions, and we just appreciate you so much. So be well, and I think, Joanne, let's wait one more minute to see if there's any other questions, and then we will close. Again, thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, Saganya. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Matt. And thank all of you.